Hey, Cypher here. This is the second part of a two-part series on Woodrow Wilson. The first part was about his life prior to 1912, and this is his entire presidency. I highly recommend going and seeing the previous one if you haven't seen it, because I'm going to be referencing it plenty, and, well, bashing on Woodrow Wilson is just fun. Damn it, Wilson! Woodrow Wilson began working immediately after taking the presidency. He managed to pass several key pieces of legislation, which he called the New Liberty, which he had actually campaigned for during the election. This is actually where we started to see the shift in the word liberalism, because this New Liberty was essentially expansion of the government in order to protect people's liberty. Or so said the propaganda. All of these things were passed within the first couple years of his presidency. He created the Federal Reserve System, which replaced the central bank, which had been functioning all the way back since 1846. This vastly expanded the reserve system's power and outreach, while also making it somehow more independent of the government than the previously named Independent Reserve. It was hoped that the Fed, as it's called, would be able to stem future panics, but they don't really have a good record on that at all. Then there was the creation of the Federal Trade Commission, which came along with an expansion in the Sherman Antitrust Act called the Clayton Act. The FTC lessened the legal proceedings that were necessary to go trust busting, while also making the regulation of monopolistic practices more easily enforced. Of course, it also stopped trust busting of certain monopolies by categorizing them in particular ways, such as utility companies. In the midst of all this supposed freedom, Wilson quietly allowed his cabinet to start segregating the federal workforce. As black people started losing their jobs and being segregated into more menial positions, the whole problem became well known, despite Wilson doing this pretty covertly. This kind of executive overreach hadn't happened before, let alone the obvious racism in it, so Republicans protested fiercely. A few civil rights leaders met with Wilson, trying to dissuade him of the whole policy. But of course, Wilson was quite a racist, and he thought that this was actually part of his whole new liberalism. By making race relations better, like that makes any sense, blacks were being liberated. Don't you see? In reality, it diminished their opportunities significantly, and in one of the places they used to be able to expect relatively equal opportunity employment. Wilson essentially brought Jim Crow to the federal government as part of his whole new freedom. As if to connect this racism to his historical writing, Wilson screened The Birth of a Nation in 1915, which discreetly quoted him at the White House. By screening it there, a first in presidential history, he legitimized the movie. He even said, "It is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so terribly true." As a prominent lost cause historian, his ignorance of the truth was a prominent part of pretty much everything he ever did. The Ku Klux Klan came into being again, basically because of this movie, and Wilson's support of it, despite prominent historians trying to fight against the falsehoods it fostered. This is how based on a true story movies can truly cause a problem. Lastly, the 16th Amendment had been passed before his presidency, but he presided over the creation of legislation that created the graduated income tax system that we live in today. Because of this tax system, Democrats lowered tariffs to historic lows. Those tariffs would bounce back again under Republican control after Wilson's administration, but from then on, they would continuously be lowered. Amazingly, all of this was done in the first couple years of Wilson's administration. He was following a lot of trends from his predecessors, but in many ways it was a more conservative approach to progressivism as opposed to what Roosevelt and Taft had been doing prior. These reforms centered more and more power on the federal government and brought much of it under the control of the executive branch. Just as Wilson had complained decades before, he was basically trying to rid the government of its checks and balances in order to center power on a great orator, such as himself. Yet all of this change took a back seat to an even worse power grab. Woodrow Wilson reformulated the way we think about international diplomacy. To this day, most policymakers can be referred to as Wilsonian. The basic idea is that American values should be spread across the world through America's foreign policy. This whole thing took the old isolationism and combined it with a new form of imperialism, pushing aside those who are now called realists. I'm not joking. After the whole Philippines debacle, which was still going on at the beginning of his presidency, America was fed up with colonialism. But instead of learning from that mistake, Wilson wanted to impose a new form of imperialism. So American exceptionalism turned to fighting to make the world safe for democracy. As he would say in his 1917 State of the Union address, calling for intervention. The problem is, it's fighting for democracy elsewhere. Or as The Atlantic puts it, he made the world safe for US interventionism. The beginnings of this were with his policies towards Latin America. Wilson had inherited a couple of wars. One was the dwindling moral wars in the Philippines, which quickly ended, but the other was fairly different. Taft had invaded Nicaragua in 1912 as part of their election process, and had left a legation there as an occupying force. Wilson continued the occupation and used it as an example for further wars. The US had been intervening in foreign affairs in a number of ways as part of Roosevelt's whole speak softly and carry a big stick policy, but under the progressive Republican presidents, they were supposed to be fairly quick affairs that advanced only American interests. Wilson took that whole idea and added his whole racist and paternalistic ideology. He started meddling in Latin American politics. The US had been turning away from imperialism, but Wilson brought it back full circle. He started by denying the legitimacy of the Mexican government. As tensions rose with Germany, he used their meddling in Mexican politics as a reason to invade Mexico, which happened in 1914 with a short-lived yet very bloody affair. Then he used the same reasoning on Haiti in 1915. Despite having pulled out of Tampico, Mexico in 1914, he invaded Haiti and fully occupied it in 1915. The US completely took over the country and tried to institute a stable regime. This was the first time in American history in which the US directly intervened and changed a regime through military force. There had been numerous interventions that had supported such efforts before, but never anything directly by the US. Supposedly, this was for the betterment of the tottering Haitian Republic, but instead, it turned into an occupation that lasted until 1934, and it completely failed to create a stable government. Wilson didn't learn from these mistakes because he did it again and again, using his whole idea of helping other countries to self-determine their own affairs. He invaded the Dominican Republic right across the island from Haiti under the same stupid ideology. That war lasted until 1924 and did absolutely nothing, save for the US being able to control their customs revenue until 1941, because ultimately greed is what always underlies the decision to intervene. But an old-style intervention did come through during his presidency. There had been a bit of a border war with Mexico since their 1911 revolution started kind of spilling over into our borders. Up until Wilson's presidency, the US had been trying to keep the Mexican Revolution in Mexico, and that's it. Despite numerous battles crossing the border, illegal usage of the border as a safe haven, and the chaos of the situation kind of disrupting US commerce. But with Wilson at the helm, he steered US policy into picking favorites in Mexico. When one of those favorites went rogue and sacked a few American towns, it was time for a good old punitive expedition to root out Pancho Villa. The Carranza government didn't like General Pershing's troops running amok and trying to root out the bandit, so they turned around and started fighting Americans. It turned into a mess, as interventions inevitably do. In the meantime, Wilson had to run for re-election. The Republicans were still in disarray from 1912, and they ended up nominating a lukewarm candidate, but Wilson came close to losing. World War I had begun in 1914, and the entire race centered on how neutral the US should be, with both candidates actually claiming to believe in neutrality. But we all know Wilson had already undermined that neutrality. But most people didn't notice. Well, with the US occupation still kind of happening in northern Mexico, the Zimmerman telegram came out, and the US entered World War I with a full declaration of war a couple months later. But we pulled out of Mexico before the declaration. There was a lot of opposition to this war at first, but Wilson still believed in the whole great orator excuse for power grabs, and this was a heck of a golden opportunity to grab power. Because of the heavy opposition to the war, Wilson managed to silence a lot of it through legislation. The first bill came quickly after the declaration of war, called the Espionage Act. You guys have probably heard of the whole limitation of free speech that says that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater? Well, that's actually from the Supreme Court, who decided that this act was constitutional, even though it mandated the arrest of anyone who said that the war was wrong. Protesters represented what the court called a clear and present danger to the recruitment of soldiers. It was one of the worst decisions the Supreme Court has ever made. Yet, the Espionage Act is actually still in effect, though it's been amended quite a few times to be less overbearing. Next was the Sedition Act, which was an even worse violation of the First Amendment. This was essentially just a bunch of amendments to the Espionage Act in order to make it more brutal. Beyond just speaking in any way that could interfere with the war effort, the Sedition Act made it a prosecutable offense to willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, or the Constitution of the United States, or the military or naval forces of the United States, or the flag. People were being rounded up for sedition, and at least 1,000 convictions were handed out. Worse still, this continued until after the war, when the Sedition Act was repealed in 1920, at the tail end of Wilson's presidency. All of this was directly asked for by Wilson prior to World War I in 1950, and was urged further by the US entering the war. Along with these gross violations came the creation of 2 domestic spying agencies, both of which were engineered specifically to keep people subjected to the war effort. First was the rebranding of the Military Intelligence Division. The MID was obviously meant for war, but it started keeping tabs on potential spies, including an entire division dedicated to Negro subversion. If you think this is a bit of an overreach, just you wait. An organization was created called the American Protective League. They numbered possibly as many as 250,000 Americans. They essentially became private domestic spies, and Wilson allowed them to work with the Bureau of Investigation to catalog pretty much everything. In fact, this is where J. Edgar Hoover got his start. Working together, they worked with the BOI and the MID to commit such incredible violations of civil liberties as to make the CIA and NSA jealous today. Domestic spying in the United States was never worse than in 1918 and 1919. Of course, it gets a lot worse. A further way of stopping disloyalty was with a rash of lynchings across the United States. It became an epidemic for 3 years, and Wilson turned a blind eye, because apparently he liked lynching. He was more attentive to branding the war itself. In January of 1918, he had come up with a way to make the war seem like a crusade for democracy, and announced it with his 14 points. They all seemed noble, like making the world more open to trade, self-determination for nations, lesser colonialism, and the creation of a League of Nations. Of course, all of these things were designed with ulterior motives. Freer trade meant that smaller economies couldn't protect themselves with tariffs. Self-determination was a dog whistle for imposed American-style republics. Colonialism was only going to be replaced with Wilson's new style of imperialism. And the impotence of the League of Nations makes the United Nations seem like an omnipotent utopian organization by comparison. Wilson almost immediately started violating his own 14 points when he authorized the Russian intervention only a couple months later. Point 6 clearly states, Russia should be given an unhampered and unembarrassed opportunity for the independent determination of her own political development and national policy. Not on Wilson's watch. So let's send American troops under spurious reasons to take over most of the country, given here if you care to read the excuses. None of those reasons work under the tiniest of scrutiny, and everyone had no idea what they were doing besides holding territory against the Bolsheviks. On the same day as World War I's armistice, a huge fight happened in Archangel Oblast, with Americans fighting Soviets led by Trotsky himself on their own native soil. The battle is hilariously called the Battle of Armistice Day, or Peace Day's Bloody Battle. So much irony in that. And what a travesty the entire Russian intervention was, and it continued until 1920, and ended in a clear military defeat for the US. But we did achieve victory in World War I, so Wilson sailed away from America to participate in the Versailles Treaty negotiations, a presidential first. And of course, he failed to live up to his ideology when he let international borders be drawn by Europeans, passed massive punitive actions against Germany that would ultimately fail to stymie another world war, and ignored dozens of nationalists begging for his attention for the newly drawn world, including numerous representatives from Russia, Ho Chi Minh from Indochina, and worst of all, civil rights leaders from his own country. Instead, he just wanted to get the whole League of Nations thing going, and he did. But the US had already grown wary of this. Republicans blocked the ratification of the treaty for the League of Nations, and Wilson spent his final year and a half in office working himself raw trying to get the League of Nations off the ground. He even had another seizure and practically went comatose. Supposedly, his wife, whom he'd actually married during the presidency, kind of ran the executive branch for half a year as a result, though that is heavily debated. But America never joined the League of Nations. Instead of promoting that failure, he could have helped people during the 1919 Red Scare. But the executive branch did absolutely nothing to help out in what I call America's craziest year. Nothing useful at all. He could have supported women's suffrage and helped the 19th Amendment along. He could have prevented some of the racial violence of the Red Summer, maybe helped hundreds of people who were persecuted for being socialists, ended the Russian intervention in a timely manner, stopped the MID and APL, and soon-to-be FBI from using their resources to hunt Bolsheviks. Or he could have even stopped the mess that he helped create with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Alas, with all the power that he had amassed during his presidency, he did nothing. The only good thing he did was try to stop prohibition from being enforced, but Congress overrode his veto. After he recovered from his coma, he acted like an early lame duck and did absolutely nothing for the rest of his presidency. He lasted for 3 more years after that, and died of a stroke in 1924. Well, that would seem to be the end of Woodrow Wilson, but he left a hell of a wake. Wilsonianism, as an international policy on the basis of ideology that often leads to spurious wars, is still a major part of US foreign relations. Realists have tried to dislodge it, but it stays, festering in politicians' minds. How could they resist asserting American hegemony to make the world safe for democracy? He also perverted liberalism into empowering the government for the sake of our new freedoms, while underwriting it all with the institution of Jim Crow at the federal level. What a great legacy he's left. Essentially, his legacy is US interventionism, which has led to the loss of thousands upon thousands of lives under stupid circumstances, and federal racism. Good job, Wilson.
One more thing!
Alright, I know I've used good old Willie as a rhetorical punching bag here, but he does deserve it. After all, he was a historian. He is a prime example of what bad history can do. Obviously, I don't have much nice to say about him. He was a bad historian who rose to power for the sake of pushing the ideology he had come up with as a result of his historical interpretations. Those historical interpretations pushed him into creating a new form of imperialism and a very racist policy to underlie all of it. He left an indelible and ultimately malignant mark on US history. I can think of no president who has left such a lingering mark that has damaged U.S. history forever. God damn it, Wilson.